a 2-day review session because I think that this is a little bit dense. And I think if we break it up into just 2 smaller review days as opposed to 1 big one, you're going to feel more confident. So today's lesson is going to be only when a is equal to 1. In other words, it's just x squared plus bx plus c. So we're going to do 5 problems involving factoring, 5 problems using quadratic formula, but they're going to be the same 5 problems. So first things first, x squared plus 14x plus 45 is equal to 0. In other words, 2 numbers that multiply to positive 45 and add to 14. Okay, so we can do this by figuring out the combination. If you want to figure out this combination, pause the screen in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so if you figured this out on your own, awesome. But if you wanted to do this on your own, you would have known that the combination is 5 times 9. 5 times 9 is 45. 5 plus 9 is 14. So that's the winning team. And remember, since a is equal to 1, we don't have to split the middle term. We can jump right into this. X plus 5 times x plus 9 is equal to 0. Now that we know this, quickly, we can just jump right into the zero product principle. In other words, we can say either x plus 5 is equal to 0 or x plus 9 is equal to 0. And we solve for x on both equations. So let's do it. Okay, so let's do x plus 5 is equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. And x is equal to negative 5 is one of the solutions. The other solution is when you set x plus 9 equal to 0, you subtract 9 from both sides, and you get x is equal to negative 9. And I know I was talking in the very beginning, but I'm looking at the time right now, 2:17. Notice how much quicker it is when you can just factor. Use that whenever you can. Okay, so now I'm really going to pay attention. I'm going to start it at, let's just say 229, 230. X squared minus 11x minus 26 is equal to 0. Okay, so remember that a is equal to 1, so all I care about is what 2 numbers multiply to negative 26 and add to negative 11. So I'm going to pay attention here. If you know the combination, if you're trying to figure out the combination, pause the screen in 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, if it multiplies to negative 26, it needs to be a positive times a negative. But of that positive negative combination, what does that add to negative 11 tell me? The negative number needs to be stronger than the positive. So in particular, you should have come up with positive 2 times negative 11. 2 times negative, times negative 13, I apologize. I was looking at the negative 11. 2 times negative 13 is negative 26. 2 plus negative 13 is negative 11. Sorry, I got a little bit distracted there. Okay, so it's 2 times negative 13. So now we split this up into x plus 2 times x minus 13 is equal to 0. And now that we use the zero product principle, we can factor this out into x plus 2 equals 0, or x minus 13 is equal to 0. So let's get on with it. So x plus 2 is equal to 0. And now let's solve for x. Well, I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides, and that gets me x is equal to negative 2. However, the other solution requires us to add 13 on both sides. So that means either x is equal to negative 2 or x is equal to positive 13. I'm just going to pause it. Oh, look at that. It took me about 2 minutes and 10 seconds to do this problem just by factoring. And that was because I was teaching. If I was a student, I'd probably do it much faster. But yeah, so factor whenever you can because it's quicker. All right, number 3. X squared plus 2x plus 12 is equal to 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0 Figure out what two numbers multiply to 12 and add to 2. Well, can't say I'm optimistic. Let me try 1 and 12. 1 times 12 is 12. 1 plus 12 is 13, so that doesn't work. 2 times 6 is 12. 2 plus 6 is 8. Okay, that doesn't work. 3 times 4 is 12. 3 plus 4 is 7. And I'm out of whole number combinations. You know what? We'll save this. We'll do the quadratic formula later, just to confirm, because I think I have an idea. So we'll do the quadratic formula on number 3 later. All right, x squared plus x minus 56 is equal to 0. Okay, well, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 56 and add to positive 1. Okay. So two numbers that multiply to negative 56 and add to 1. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it needs to be a positive times a negative to get to multiply to negative 56. However, adding to positive 1 tells me that the positive needs to be stronger than the negative. So in particular, you must have gotten negative 7 times positive 8. Negative 7 times positive 8 is negative 56. Negative 7 plus 8 is positive 1. That's our winning team. So now that we've got this, when a is equal to 1, let's split that middle term. Let's factor it into x minus 7 times x plus 8 is equal to 0. Now that we've got a multiplication problem, we can use the zero product principle to separate these into two separate equations. Factoring is your number one go-to. So now we've got x plus 8 is equal to 0, or x minus 7 is equal to 0. Okay, let's start with the left. I'm going to add 7 on both sides, and that gets me x is equal to 7. Okay, the other solution, we've got x plus 8 is equal to 0, so let's subtract 8 from both sides and get the other solution, either x is equal to positive 7 or x is equal to negative 8. Okay. Last one that we'll do, and then we'll move on to doing all these in the quadratic formula. X squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 0. So, business as usual. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 16 and add to negative 8. If you want to do this on your own, go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to give the solution in 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, in order for it to multiply to a positive and add to a negative, it needs to be a negative-negative combination. In particular, it needs to be negative 4 times negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. Negative 4 plus negative 4 is negative 8. And that's our winning team. And now this factors into x minus 4 times x minus 4 is equal to 0. Well, since they're the same thing, we might as well just combine them into x minus 4 quantity squared is equal to 0. Now, since they're the same thing, there's really only one equation, and that is x minus 4 is equal to 0. And in order to solve this, we need to add 4 on both sides. So in this case, there's only one solution, and that is x is equal to positive 4, and that's the only one. Okay, so now that we've gotten, I'm just going to show these really quick. Now that we've gotten all 5 of these problems and their solutions, let's move on to solving all 5 of these using the quadratic formula. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to pull up problem number 1 with the quadratic formula. Okay. X squared plus 14x plus 45 equals 0. Well, let's say I use the quadratic formula because factoring is too hard. No problem. I've actually graded tests where students have literally done quadratic formula every single time. It never fails. Take your time. A is 1, B is 14, and C is 45. So if we want to solve for all the x values that make this equal to 0, we just plug it in to this formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all that over 2a. So let's plug in negative b. B is 14, plus or minus the square root of 14 squared minus 4 times a times c. All that over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay, well now that we've put the pieces in, let's just clean it up a little bit. Negative 14, any double negatives? No, we're good. So this is just negative 14 plus or minus the square root of 14 squared. I might need a calculator for that part. 14 squared is 196. Okay, and I know this off the top of my head because I do weightlifting. Negative 4 times 1 times 45. If I've got 4 plates, that would be 180 pounds worth. So that would be 196 minus 180. And then 2 times 1 is just 2. So now let's clean this up. Negative 14 plus or minus the square root of 196 minus 180, that'd be 16 over 2. So now I'm going to pay attention to this square root because I care about what this value is, because this is telling me that since b squared minus 4ac is positive, that means that there are going to be 2 real solutions. This is just a footnote to myself. So there's going to be an x1 and an x2 is what since it's positive. Okay, well now let's take the square root of 16. Well, that's negative 14 plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4 over 2. So that's where the plus or minus comes in, because now that there's 2 real solutions, we're going to break this up into negative 14 plus 4 over 2 or negative 14 minus 4 over 2. So let's start with this side. So now we're going to split this. Negative 14 plus 4 over 2 or negative 14 minus 4 over 2. So let's start with the left side. Well, negative 14 plus 4 would be negative 10. And over 2, we'd get negative 5. So one of the solutions is x1 is negative 5, or x equals negative 5 is one of the solutions. All right? Now let's take a look at the other side. Negative 14 minus 4, that would be negative 18 over 2. So x2 would be equal to negative 18 over 2, which is negative 9, which is exactly what we got by factoring. I'm just going to scan it really quick. Alrighty. All right, moving on to problem number 2. And again, this took a while, and that's even with the layout that I made, this fill in the blank, if you will. All right, x squared minus 11x minus 26 is equal to 0. All right, let's say factoring is really, really hard, because it can be. No worries. Plug it into the quadratic formula. A equals 1, B equals negative 11, and C is equal to negative 26. Okay, so now that we've got our A, B, and C, the x-intercepts of this quadratic equation can be found by using the quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all that over 2a. So let's plug in b. Well, negative blank. I'm still plugging in negative 11, so I've got negative 11. Plus or minus the square root of negative 11, quantity squared, minus 4 times a times c, which is negative 26. All that over 2 times a, which is 2 times 1. All right, so now let's clean this up. negative 11, that'd be positive 11, plus or minus the square root of negative 11 quantity squared. So that'd be negative 11 times negative 11, that'd be 121. All right, negative 4 times 1 times negative 26, well, that's negative 4 times negative 26. That's going to be a positive for sure. I'm going to need a calculator for that. Well, I know 2 times 1 is 2, so I want to get that out of the way. So let's do negative 4 times negative 26. That would be positive 104. Okay, so now I've got 11 plus or minus the square root of 121 plus 104. So that'd be 225. And then just for the heck of it, 225, the square root is 15. Okay, so I've got 11 plus or minus the square root of 225 over 2. Once again, I take a little pause, and now that I've got this discriminant, I know that b squared minus 4ac is positive, so that is an indicator that there are going to be two real solutions. In other words, there's going to be an x1 and a y1. There's going to be two x values that make this equation equal to 0. So now, without further ado, we figure out what the square root of 225 is, and it is 15. So now I've got two equations, 11 plus 15 over 2, 11 minus 15 over 2. So let's start. Let's set them up. 11 plus 15 over 2, or 11 minus 15 over 2. So now, let's figure this out. 11 plus 15, that would be 26 over 2. And 26 divided by 2 is positive 13. So one of the solutions is that x is equal to 13. Let's figure out what the other one is. 11 minus 15, that'd be negative 4. And negative 4 divided by 2 would be negative 2. So your two solutions, just like how we did it with factoring, are x equals 13 or x equals negative 2. Thank you, quadratic formula. Okay, moving on to problem number 3. Okay. Just want to confirm. There we go. So remember when we did this with factoring, it wasn't exactly comfortable. Well, let's do this. X squared plus 2x plus 12 is equal to 0. Well, I'm going to use a equals 1, b equals 2, and c equals 12 equals 0. So now let's plug it in the formula. Figure out the x-intercepts by doing negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c over 2 times a. So now, since b is 2, plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times a times c, which is 12, all that over 2 times a, which is 1. Let's clean this up now. Well, we've got negative 2. Well, that's not a double negative, so that's just negative 2. Plus or minus the square root of 2 squared, which is 4. And then negative 4 times 1 times 12, that's going to be negative 48. All that over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, so now we've got negative 2, and there's a 2 on the bottom. 4 minus 48 is negative 44. Okay, well, that's why I couldn't factor. There's a problem with the quadratic formula. Specifically, the discriminant is negative. So because b squared minus 4ac is negative, I can't take the square root of a negative number in my calculator. Because if I do the square root of negative 44 in the calculator, it says, hey, error, that's not a real answer. Because if I did the square root of 44, right, it'd be some weird decimal, 6.63, 3249, blah, 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 blah. But if I did it with the negative, that there's no number that repeats itself that will get a negative number. A negative times a negative is a positive times a positive is a positive. So that's why b squared minus 4ac is negative. Therefore, there is no real solution. There are two, when you go into algebra 2, there are two complex solutions. So two numbers involving imaginary numbers, but there's no real solution. That is the solution, is that there is none. It'll never cross the x-axis. Okay. Number 4. X squared plus x minus 56 is equal to 0. Okay. So first things first. A equals 1. Oh, B equals 1. And C equals negative 56. Let's plug it into the quadratic formula and see what happens. Okay. So we've got B is equal to 1, so negative B, 1, plus or minus the square root of 1 squared, minus 4 times A, hey, another 1, times C, which is negative 56. All that over 2 times A, which is 1. Okay, so now let's plug it in. Negative 1, there's no double negative, so I'm very happy about that. Negative 1, plus or minus the square root of 1 squared, well, 1 times 1 is 1, negative 4 times 1 times negative 56. Okay, so negative 4 times 1 times negative 56, well, that's going to be positive 224. All that over 2 times 1, which is 2. So now we've got negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 225 over 2. Okay, well now things are back to normal. Because b squared minus 4ac is positive, okay, well, there's going to be an x1 and an x2, so there's going to be two real solutions. Okay, so now let's figure out what the square root of 225 is. Negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 225, which we know now is 15. All that over 2a, which is just 2. Okay, so now there's going to be two equations, specifically negative 1 plus 15 over 2 and negative 1 minus 15 over 2. So let's plug them in. Negative 1 plus 15 over 2, because now we're going to split this up, or x2, which is negative 1 minus 15 over 2. Let's solve this one on the left. Negative 1 plus 15 is 14 over 2. 14 divided by 2 is 7. So therefore, x1 is equal to 7. Okay, let's take a look at the right side now. x2 is negative 1 minus 15 over 2, which is negative 16 over 2. And negative 16 divided by 2 is negative 8. And just like that, we've got our two solutions. This time we did this problem with the quadratic formula. Okay, let's move on to our last problem of the day. Problem number 5. X squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 0. Let me just get the back page out of the way. X squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 0. This time, let's let A equal 1, B equal negative 8, and C equal positive 16. Okay, so now we're going to plug in negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C. So I'm going to plug in B, which is, in this case, negative 8. So negative 8, plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is negative 8 quantity squared, minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is positive 16. All that over 2 times A, which is 2 times 1. So now let's clean this up. Negative 8 is positive 8, plus or minus the square root of negative 8 quantity squared, which is 64. Negative 4 times 1 times 16, that is negative 64. All that over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, so now we've got 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 64, which is 0 over 2. So because the discriminant is 0, so if b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, that means that there's only going to be one real solution. So think about it like this. If the square root of 0 is 0, then we do 8 plus 0 over 2 and 8 minus 0 over 2. Either way, you're going to get 8 over 2. So why not just cut to the chase and say, hey, 8 over 2, which means that the x is equal to positive 4, which is what we said in the very beginning. Okay. In the next video, we're going to be doing review problems where a is not equal to 1. So brace yourself.